Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today we're going to be talking about the Buccaneers, both the television show, which I just absolutely ate up recently, and also, more importantly, the novel by Edith Wharton. For those of you on YouTube, you can see that I've made a tiny bit of an effort here with the outfit and the hair. The Buccaneers is a book that and television show that absolutely cries out for some serious costuming, but I'm away and I don't have all my crazy wigs, so I wasn't able to get into like the full Regency era hairdo. Speaking of hair, I should maybe just get this out of the way right from the start. I was so distracted by Nan's hair. I watched a couple of episodes with my sister and we both were just like, what is happening with this hair? Everyone else had like these long locks and she had that kind of awkward, like it wasn't quite shoulder length, it wasn't quite chin length, and kind of like chunky. I mean, I don't mean to be shitting on her hair, but I just couldn't figure it out. Even when she would have it up in like some crazy updo like all the rest of the young women, it still looked a little bit wacky. This improved in the second season, but in that first season, I just was so confused. And then, this is the kind of magic that we are going to experience today. I was reading The Buccaneers, the novel by Edith Wharton, and toward the very end, Miss Testvalley, who is Nan's governess, finds this like incredible French hair lotion or hair oil that she just thinks is incredible. And it was amazing because she's talking to Nan about how like amazing this hair oil is. And Nan is just kind of like not having it. And part of me was like, wow, maybe the producers and creators really like read this very carefully and really were building on this idea that Nan was like not into the French hair oil. But probably we should take a quick step back. I think a lot of you know, for 7 months of this year, it began on January 7th and for literally until, the very end of July, I had all these kidney issues, had a couple of different surgeries. I was literally uncomfortable for 7 months. And one of the things, of course, that got me through it was television. I had not watched the first season of The Buccaneers. A very good friend and a very excellent television judge said, wait, this is exactly what you need, because I would have 2 whole seasons to be watching. And the show absolutely delivered. It's a little frothy. There are parts of it that were certainly overly dramatic, but I loved every bit of it. And of course, what I tend to do when I'm watching television is, when they say skip intro, I always like hit the little thing and we skip the intro. And so I was like well into the second season, decided to not skip the intro. Actually, I probably like missed my window. So I was like, oh God, okay, I have to watch the intro. And at the end of the intro, when it was like based on a novel by Edith Wharton, I was like, what? And I was so happy. I hopped online, ordered my copy right away, and it was such a delightful experience. And actually, before we move away from the idea of the opening of the television show, I have to say, I'm kind of hung up on this idea that all of these television intros are all kind of the same. I feel like it started with Game of Thrones, where we have all of those like kind of puzzle pieces coming up out of the map, and then there's like some sort of molten, metallic liquid that's like flowing through all of these places. And then The Crown had that thing where like the molten metallic stuff like is like flowing around and it's kind of ominous and weird. And this one was kind of the same. I mean, not exactly, but you have like all the hydrangeas and whatnot. I really love the font, that big fat like yellow Buccaneers. If you're on the YouTube, I'll go ahead and show that font that I loved so much and that will be familiar to a lot of you. This is probably a good place to say that if you are listening to this as a podcast, that is great, but it might be a good one to watch on the YouTube. You can maybe just like have it go on in the background somewhere, because today I'm going to feather in tons and tons of images. When I do the YouTube, I like to be able to show you some of the visuals of, whatever it is we're looking at, the author, the setting. And this is one between the visual nature of the television show, obviously, and then because of the historical nature of the novel, and just like because Edith Wharton is such a baller, there are going to be a lot of photos. So now we're going to move on a little bit more to like what we are actually doing today. And what I'm going to do is not try to convince you that you need to read The Buccaneers. What I am going to convince you of is that you should read some Edith Wharton. We're going to do a bio in a minute, but most of you have probably heard of The Age of Innocence or The House of Mirth. You maybe read Ethan Frome back in high school. If you are kind of hankering for some Edith Wharton, and I hope you will be by the end because her prose is absolutely sensational. And if you finish Buccaneers and you're like, shoot, I'm kind of sad that Buccaneers is over, you can really pick up some Edith Wharton and just like imagine a whole cinematic Buccaneers experience that is happening right with the Age of Innocence or the House of Mirth. So we'll just go ahead and dive right in. Edith Wharton died during the writing of this book. She had a synopsis, she had an outline, although she did actually diverge quite significantly from the synopsis. But she had like a, the full kind of conception and makings of this book. And then she died when she was about 3/4 of the way through. That was in 1937. They published the unfinished manuscript in 1938. And then one of her scholars went on to sort of complete the manuscript and published it in the early 90s. In fact, in 1993, that woman's name is Marion Mainwaring, which actually makes her sound like she just popped right out of the pages of a Wharton book. So I was a little skeptical. And as I was reading through, I knew that after chapter 30, that's when Marion was going to take over. And I have to say, kudos to Marion. I think Marion did a great job finishing this novel. And then today, obviously, we're going to be talking about the adaptation of the television. We're going to talk about some similarities, some differences, some departures, and a little bit about kind of the message of Edith Wharton and how it both agrees and somewhat disagrees with the tack that the creators of Buccaneers have taken. But the other thing I want to do today is read to you and talk a little bit about why Edith Wharton's prose is so amazing. It is such an absolute joy. She's kind of sassy, and just the prose is so rich and it's so strong, and these women are amazing. She does minor characters like very few authors. They're so strong. And we're going to take a look at some various aspects. These descriptions, there are a couple we're going to read today that are just absolutely sublime. She does a little bit of something that one of my writing teachers called the architectural digest approach. And he said this in a very disparaging way. And I was like, wait, what? Architectural digest mode of writing actually sounds pretty good to me. He was not into the idea of describing things, of a lot of detail of the interior of a space. And when she does it, it is so good. She's also very good at exteriors. So we're going to see both of those. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and give you a quick agenda so you know what we're up to today. We're going to start by looking at this incredible narrative voice that she has. It is a very strong, omniscient third-person narrator, pretty standard for kind of a late realist novel. But it's a very nimble narrator. It's entering into the points of view of a lot of different characters, which is so important because this is a novel that is very much about judginess. One of the things I loved best about it is there are a lot of descriptions from the perspective of English women, and they are, of course, judging these young American buccaneers. And Edith Wharton is so good at having them say something that they think is insulting. And I, as an American, was like, yes, the British moral climate might have been a little bit too chilly for these young American women. And yes, they are brash. And yes, they are very loud. But the genius there is that she's inhabiting all of these different points of view in order to give us a very complete picture of what we are seeing / reading. So we'll look at the narrative voice. We're then going to look at a bunch of similarities between the novel and the television show. Then we're going to look at some differences, which was pretty fun to look at. We're going to move on and talk a tiny bit about just like the gorgeousness of the prose, why it is so beautiful. We're going to talk a little bit about figurative language, just a couple of examples, mostly symbolism. Then I want to take a quick look at how well she drafts minor characters. Toward the end, we're going to do my thing that I sometimes do with names, which was so fun. I'm going to actually spell some of them for you. I have to say the whole time when they're like, it's Brittlesea, I'm like, how are they spelling that? How are they spelling that? Actually, I'm going to throw you a bone. I'm going to tell you how they spell that right now. It is Brightlingsea. So Brightlingsea. So now you understand why everyone's mispronouncing that. But there are also some really interesting nuances to the names that Edith Wharton chose. So we'll do that toward the end. And then we'll talk about the sort of messages and how the show departs in some ways, but also is very faithful in some ways to the very important message that Edith Wharton was promoting in all of her novels. She was really prolific, and certainly in Buccaneers. So we're going to go ahead and dive into the text here. Actually, before we do, I'm just going to touch very quickly on the title. For anyone who is here because you want to become a better reader, which is one of the things we are doing at the Fox page, although I don't like the idea of anyone like needing to improve their reading. The way that you read is excellent and perfect for you. But I understand the idea of wanting to get a little more out of it. The way you do that is simply by paying attention. I almost just skipped over the title, but it is very important to pay attention. So Buccaneers is obviously like another name for pirate. I actually like went and looked at the difference between pirate and Buccaneers, and I think it's pirates. Oh my gosh, now I'm forgetting. Pirates were known to have been like sent out by people. They already had money in order to like they were basically paid to go out and do their thing, to go out and find ships and do all sorts of plunder and whatever those pirates were up to. Whereas Buccaneers were doing this without any kind of backing, which makes total sense. Obviously, Edith Wharton is tapping into this idea of Buccaneers as being adventuresome and strong and kind of wild and crazy. It's also just a really kind of a genius title in the sense of just how it sounds. Buccaneers, or it's the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers, it's kind of a fun word to say. And it really is, it's almost like onomatopoeia in the sense that we really get the sense of them like bucking the standards of the day. And actually, you could also sort of look at the fact that there is some pirating going on in the sense that all of these young women in America wanted a title. All of these parvenu women, all of the newly rich women, they needed titles in order to be seen as legitimate people in the New York circles. And of course, the British people needed the money. So they're sort of plundering on both sides, actually. But now we're going to dive into the actual text itself. One of the things that it would be good to pay attention to here as I read these first 3 brief paragraphs is just the way that the narrative voice is working. So on page 3 here, oh my gosh, my readers look super crazy with this dress, but these are the ones I've got. They're also way too strong, so I have to hold the book really close to my face. Okay, on page 3. It was the height of the racing season in Saratoga. The thermometer stood over 90, and a haze of sun-powdered dust hung in the elms along the street facing the Grand Union Hotel, and over the scant triangular lawns planted with young firs and protected by a low white rail from the depredations of dogs and children. Mrs. St. George, whose husband was one of the gentlemen most interested in the racing, sat on the wide hotel veranda, a jug of iced lemonade at her elbow and a palmetto fan in one small hand, and looked out between the immensely tall white columns of the portico, which so often reminded cultured travelers of the Parthenon at Athens, parentheses, Greece. Okay, there is so much to talk about here. I mean, I wasn't going to do like a super textual deep dive, but we might have to just like pause here and just admire what it is that she's doing. So we begin with this omniscient narrator. The narrator is pulled way back, but this is also a narrator who like really has her finger on the pulse of what is going on here. It's so interesting. I tend to think of an omniscient third person narrator as male, as kind of a male voice. I think that's like weirdly because of the patriarchy. It's sort of my default. But sometimes in a case like this, especially if I have a female author, I will feel like the voice is slightly more of a woman's voice, which I very much like. But this is one who is both very authoritative and also very much in the know. So we have at the beginning this kind of bold statement, which points to the omniscience. It was the height of the racing season in Saratoga. But then we drop immediately to this really sensual paragraph. Edith Wharton's writing is so sensual. So we have this idea of the heat, which is important because this book is about putting pressure on people. And there's nothing like heat to help understand why characters feel under pressure. But then we have a haze of sun-powdered dust. I mean, that is unbelievable. It's unusual, and you can kind of see it. It seems so beautiful. In my mind, it's kind of pollen from the fir trees. And then we have, although they're elms, says it right here. Then we have the haze of sun-powdered dust hung in the elms along the street facing the Grand Union Hotel. So Grand Union, I actually don't know if that actually existed, but from the beginning, even subconsciously, she's talking about the idea of a union, this idea of marriage, which is really the driving force in this whole entire book. And it's not just any union, it is Grand Union. And then the idea of the scant triangular lawns, there is this idea that she embraces of the United States as being, kind of young and a little scant, and that everything is kind of newly planted. And then she's so genius, she has this protective low fence to keep things from depredation. So this idea of needing to protect things, in this case it's from dogs and children, but we get the sense right at the beginning of things that are young and burgeoning as needing protection. Then, of course, we go to this really gorgeous thing with Mrs. St. George. She's on the veranda. This is the kind of thing that I think my MFA teacher would not have liked. But when we hear about the jug of iced lemonade at her elbow and a palmetto fan in one small hand, first of all, the cadence of that is so beautiful, but it's so appealing. I don't know, there's something about iced lemonade and it being at her elbow and the word jug, it just immediately conjures the deliciousness, frankly, of a big jug of lemonade. But also the palmetto fan in one small hand. What you have there is assonance, which is the rhyming of those vowels, and it almost is mimicking the idea of this fan. And then, of course, palmetto is a slightly kind of exotic word here. And she pushes that exotic idea a little bit further in such a funny way to me, because suddenly we have the description of these columns and that idea of the Greek revival architecture that was so obviously trying to kind of be European here in the United States. And those columns, she says right here, so often reminded cultural travelers of the Parthenon at Athens, parentheses, Greece. The fact that she had to say that like Athens is in Greece is so funny to me. And also, of course, the Parthenon, I spent 48 hours, probably less, in Athens when I was an 11-year-old. And the one thing that we did right away is go to the Parthenon. So she is doing so much work in the very beginning here to symbolically set up the idea of the United States as new and young, and also this idea of kind of striving, the idea of trying to be European, but also being firmly American. The other thing that's important is she is starting this in Saratoga Springs. Edith Wharton is very good at explaining the importance of places like Saratoga or places like Albany. Like, these were very important and very cultured capitals, not actual capitals, but they were like very important places at the end of the 19th century. And the important thing about Saratoga, of course, is that it is based on gambling. And she says right from the start that Mrs. St. George has a husband who's really invested in the gambling. But if you are a savvy reader, you're going to take into mind the fact that all of this is a gamble. I mean, marriage is a gamble. But all of these people have these very high stakes gambles that they are all trying to kind of wrangle. And we have that notion right from the start of the book. It's just a virtuoso opening to a novel. So I mentioned that maybe you should be listening for the narrative voice in that first part, and then I didn't really talk about the narrative voice all that much. But you can see how it's pulled far back. It's talking about Saratoga in these kind of more general terms. And then we have Mrs. St. George, but kind of from the exterior. But what's amazing about this narrator is that very quickly, here we have on page 10, a small example I'd like to read of how deftly this third person narrator kind of adjoins is not a word. Wait, maybe it is. Adjoining is a word. So this narrator melds in some ways to a certain character. And then without coming out of the third person, we have the thoughts of the character. And this is important that we're staying in the third person because it makes the whole thing feel very accessible. It's very easy to understand because we have this authoritative voice that's kind of on the same plane the whole entire time. And that even when it's not these grand statements like it was the height of the season in Saratoga, even when it's very close, it's very easy to follow third person. So here we have an excellent example on page 10. What we have here is young Nan, who is here with her mother and her father and her older sister, Virginia. And we have the recent arrival of the Clausen family, Colonel Clausen. And we're going to discuss the Clausens in a moment. But Conchita is there, and we have this description of Nan's reaction to Conchita. Long before Mrs. St. George and Mrs. Elmsworth had agreed on a valuation of the newcomer, Nan had fallen under her spell. From the day when she had first seen her come whistling around the corner of the veranda, her restless little head crowned by a flapping leghorn hat with a rose under the brim, and dragging after her a reluctant poodle with a large red bow, Nan had felt the girl's careless power. What would Mrs. St. George have said if one of her daughters had strolled along had strolled along the veranda whistling and dragging a grotesque-looking toy shop animal at her heels. Miss Clausen seemed troubled by no such considerations. She sat down on the upper step of the veranda, pulled a lump of molasses candy from her pocket, and invited the poodle to get up and waltz for it. So, a couple of very quick things here. Clearly, we have just this really robust vision of a young woman who, despite the fact that her mother is Brazilian, which we are going to find out soon, we also find out that her mother is maybe not married to Colonel Clausen. We also know that Conchita Clausen is not a daughter of Mr. Clausen, but we have this young woman that Wharton describes as having careless power. So much of this book is about power, and it is about the idea of power as not being available to women. There's so many strictures against which women are fighting in this book. But right from the start, some of them, Nan and Conchita both, are armed with this kind of power. And it's beautiful that that Wharton is very kind of baldly telling us that not only does Conchita have power, but it's a careless power, which kind of magnifies, of course, the power. You also get the sense right here of judgment. At the very beginning, we have Mrs. St. George and Mrs. Elmsworth. They're still trying to judge her and figure her out, but our trusty narrator is cluing us into the fact that she and Nan are similar in some ways, and that they're young women that really do have the Buccaneers spirit. If you're on the YouTube, I'll put up a picture of a leghorn hat. I had such a hard time figuring out or like picturing that in my head, because the whole time I was thinking about there's some character, a cartoon character like Leghorn something something. So all I could picture, and I don't know, he might be a chicken. If you're on the YouTube, I'll also show you a picture of like Leghorn, blah, blah, blah. I'll also put his name, but it caused a complete blockage in my mind. I could not even begin to understand what a Leghorn hat was. I was actually also picturing a stovepipe hat. I will also put up a picture of the stovepipe hat. But regardless of my inability to recognize this hat or visualize this hat, I got plenty of a sense of what Conchita's like spirit is all about. I also was a little bit bummed out about how harsh she is about the poodle. As you guys know, I'm a total dog lover, and in fact, was the owner of two smallish poodles, not tiny ones, but smallish ones. And I love myself a poodle, so this seemed a little harsh to me. So before we move off the topic of this incredible narrator, and frankly, all of the close reading that we are doing today is in the auspices of just like enjoying this incredible prose. But this final example we're going to look at of the narrator is so deft because essentially what Wharton is doing is combining one of the characters and the omniscience of the narrator. So we have this narrator who's very powerful, and in this case, it's coming sort of even closer to Lizzie Elmsworth than we did with Nan, thinking about Conchita. I mean, in fairness, the description of Nan and Conchita is mostly just a description of Conchita. There's that little part about how Nan had fallen under her spell, but then we just have a description. In this case, we have a little more entering into the mind of Lizzie Elmsworth. And not only is Wharton showing us a little bit about who Lizzie is, but she's really moving the plot forward in this very clear, but also like very appealing kind of way. So here's the paragraph on 122. Lizzie Elmsworth was not a good-tempered girl. That just kind of cracked me up. I mean, Wharton is creating some really round characters. These are not people who are just like villains and heroes. These are people who are complex. They're people who have, good things and bad things, as do we all. So I'll continue. Lizzie Elmsworth was not a good-tempered girl, but she was too intelligent to let her temper interfere with her opportunities. She hated the St. George girls for having got ahead of her in their attack on London, but was instantly disposed to profit by the breach they had made. Virginia St. George was not clever, and Lizzie would be able to guide her. They could be of the greatest use to each other if the St. Georges could be made to enter into the plan. Exactly what plan, Lizzie herself did not know, but she felt instinctively that, like their native country, they could stand only if they were united. I mean, it's just such an incredible paragraph. I mean, it makes me actually feel like slightly patriotic, which is kind of a difficult thing to do these days. But you have this huge statement at the end here that like America, these girls have to be united. But in the very beginning of the paragraph, which actually is fitting with the idea of the United States, you have all of these kind of like bellicose terms, like warlike things. So she's talking about the St. George girls and their attack on London, and then soon after, how she's going to profit by the breach they had made. So this is one of the ways that we're kind of carrying through the idea of the Buccaneers. Like these are women who are like kind of going to all lengths to do what they want to do here. And in many ways, it's kind of warlike. But I would also argue that when we have a woman writing a book like this, that narrator can really add a lot of scope and a lot of depth and, frankly, a lot of gravitas if the narrator is nimble enough to use all of these different, in this case, it's a very kind of male metaphor here. And she does it so well. We also, I think you can get a sense from that of how strong Lizzie is. It's really just very efficient in terms of characterization, moving the plot forward, building tension. I mean, this is prose that is working on many levels and is also incredibly appealing. Okay, now that we've looked at the narrator, we're going to dive in and talk about some of the similarities and real strengths, I think, of both the novel and the adaptation. So, one of the things I love the best is that almost all of the names are the same. We're going to talk about names at the end, but you just heard about Lizzie Elmsworth and Nan. I have to say too, Nan is not my favorite. Do not love the name Nan. And I certainly didn't like it when I heard that the alternative is Annabelle. Love Annabelle. Sometime very early on in the novel, it's really funny because Miss Testvalley, the new governess for Annabelle, calls her Annabelle. And I'm like, oh my gosh, wait, great. Maybe in the book she's going to go more by Annabelle. And right away she's like, please don't call me Annabelle. I'm Nan. And I was like, oh God, okay, all right, here we go. But I do like the idea of these creators as being pretty faithful to the names, also because these names are great and very telling and doing a lot of work, which we're going to look at later. So, also very clearly, both the book and the novel are speaking to this idea of these ambitions of both the Americans who need legitimacy and the British people who need the money. It's very clear. And in many ways, the plot is sort of the same. We begin at a slightly different point, where this is right before Conchita marries Dick. I don't know why I'm smiling about that. I mean, obviously, because Dick. So we begin at a slightly different time, but lots of the same things are unfolding. Nan's character and our focus on Nan, she's clearly kind of the main character in the television adaptation. She also is very much the main character of the book. It is really her story that we are closely following, and that's the one that has the most, sort of like arc, most like effective and sort of rich arc by the end of the book. We also, in the book, have the idea of Nan both being in love with Guy Thwart and with the Duke. Speaking of names, the Duke's name in the book is Ushant, which is spelled Ushant, which is like not a great name. And in the book, he's a much more kind of straightforward, villainous kind of character. But she is in love with both of those men, so that is one of the other similarities. We also have this idea of Conchita as kind of being, because she's sort of the first in the novel, in the television show, she's the first to sort of launch herself into society and have a baby and whatnot. We have that same sort of idea in the novel, and I want to look at two quick cases where we're seeing the same kinds of things that Conchita is facing in the television show. At one point, she says to Nan that she's really worried because her child is going to look like her, is going to have darker skin, and that they don't, and that the family, who already don't like Conchita, that they are also not going to like the child because of the child's skin color. And I was very curious when I was watching the television show whether or not Wharton was going to include this subplot about racism. But I really like the fact that she sort of takes it head on. It's one of the differences here, which we're in similarities and we'll get to differences soon. But she's from Brazil. Her name is Conchita Santos Dios, although she, goes by Clausen and then she gets married. But she is Brazilian, so we know that she has darker skin. The word dusky is used a lot throughout this novel. But there was also a question at one point, a telegram from horrendous Selena Brittlesea. Basically, she asks, is she black? So we have like a very pointed discussion in the novel about racism, which was like obviously a very good thing for the creators to include in the television show. I think I just assumed that there wouldn't be this whole storyline, and yet it's definitely here, and it's done, I think, very well. So on page 5, we have the reaction on the part of the mothers, Mrs. St. George and Mrs. Elmsworth. But the thought of that new dusky Clausen woman with the queer-looking girl who was so ugly now but might suddenly turn into a beauty, Mrs. St. George had seen such cases, the instinct of organized defense awoke in her vague bosom, and she felt herself drawn to Mrs. Elmsworth and to the two Elmsworth girls, as to whom one already knew just how good-looking they were going to be. This is so funny. It's very much like the Lizzie Elmsworth paragraph that we read. And these people are very calculating. But obviously, what is important here is the idea that Mrs. St. George is suspicious of Colonel Clausen's wife and also the wife's daughter. But she also, right from the beginning, is recognizing that she is a potential beauty, and in fact, she does become very beautiful. And obviously, if someone's talking about like she's ugly now, which I mean, it's so funny how bold a lot of these statements are. But if someone is ugly now and you have the suspicion that they are going to be beautiful, they're obviously seeds of that beauty. So then on page 9, we have like this really strong endorsement of Conchita. This is so early in the novel. And so for the reader who already is clued into the fact that Nan is kind of our main character, you have kind of an extension or actually like almost like a rebuttal of what Mrs. St. George was thinking, what we saw her thinking earlier about the Clausen. So this is an extra fun section to read because it's dialogue, and there are also some very symbolic things happening here. Edith Wharton's dialogue is so good. There are actually some parts where there is verbatim stuff that is said in the show. I was going to talk about it later, but I'll just say it right now. There was a part where Guy Thwart's father says something about Guy Thwart's late mother and the fact that she was utterly unpaintable, and we have exactly that in the book. We also have that exact phrasing where all the girls arrive in London and Conchita is just miserable because the British people are so uptight. And she says that thing about how it's an ocean of silence and that they should see it like that, but they should also not be too worried because she hasn't drowned yet. So we have these verbatim things that are taken. And honestly, there were times where I would be a little suspicious because the writing to me felt a little bit stilted. And that actually was one of them, which is probably the reason why I remembered it and saw it in the novel. The one where Guy Thwart's dad calls the woman utterly unpaintable, that was just beautiful, but it didn't sound out of voice. This metaphor about the ocean and her not having drowned yet, I think it was actually the delivery of the actor, but for some reason it did sort of stick out as potentially something that was straight from the novel. But back to the point I'm making, which is that right from the beginning, Nan, our sort of hero, recognizes how amazing Conchita is. So on page 11, why can't I go with Conchita if she wants me to? Mrs. St. George's faintly withered pink turned pale. If she wants you to? Annabel St. George, what do you mean by talking to me in that way? What on earth do you care for what a girl like that wants? So again, here we have her, Mrs. St. George is really still trying to disparage her. But then we have this. Nan ground her heels into the crack between the veranda boards. So obviously there's some symbolic stuff there. I like the way that we're reminded that they are on the veranda, but really Nan is actually like physically digging in here. So Nan ground her heels into the cracks between the veranda boards. I think she's lovely. Mrs. St. George's small nose was wrinkled with disdain. The small mouth under it drooped disgustedly. She was mother smelling a drain. So this is such an odd little paragraph, but I love the way that it gets us into the minds of these girls, of the sisters. Some of the description of people's faces is just so odd to me. At one point, someone's upper lip lengthened. This is like also with disdain. And here we have her mouth drooped disgustedly. This is a time when I fall back on my MFA education. And I totally agree with the fact that if dialogue is good enough, you shouldn't have to be describing these people's faces. This aspect, the sort of Edith Wharton describing people's faces, doing this kind of thing, this is one of the ways that the book does feel distinctly like it was written in the 20th century, slightly less than 100 years ago. So right from the beginning, we have this idea of Nan as really recognizing Conchita as this phenomenal person which is obviously close to the novel. It was interesting because Nan is younger and Conchita is older. So in my mind, Conchita was maybe closer friends with Ginny and some of the other girls. And it would surprise me a little bit when it seemed like she and Nan were so close. Like when she's going to have the baby and she's like, Nan, you have to be here. And Nan's like, absolutely, I will. And then she isn't. But in the book, despite the age gap, Conchita and Nan are very, very close friends. And a lot of the plot hinges on the fact that they are so close. Okay, we're going to move on and talk about some of the differences. So one major one is the fact that Nan is not her mother's sister's child. I liked that storyline and I was really curious if it was going to be in the novel. It was not. It does feel, I mean, when you step back a little bit, it does feel very kind of soap opera-y, but it really provided some good tension. The other major change for me is that the Duke in this book, his name is Ushant. Ushant in this book, the Duke of Tintagel, he's just bad. Like he's just kind of a one note. He's pretty villainous. He's petty. He's greedy. He's calculating. He's misogynist. He's just not great. So you're going to wonder why, in fact, Nan ends up with him. And it's interesting. A lot of it hinges on the fact that she just thinks that Ginny is the best thing ever. And she's very competitive with Ginny. And she gets kind of caught up in this idea of this fantasy of becoming, a duchess. And she almost does it not to spite her sister, but in competition with her sister, and then is immediately disillusioned because, in fact, the Duke is just a total dick. And though we have the whole like Guy Thwart storyline, we do not have all of this stuff about him going off. I believe it's Italy. I actually don't know that they ever name it. I love those parts of the show where they have the facades of those beautiful houses along the water. And it's so sunny and beautiful and sensual. And you have Ginny and the baby and Guy Thwart there. That stuff is not in the book. We do have Guy Thwart go to South America. He makes lots of money there. He gets married. I believe the woman dies. And then he comes back to England. So we do have the tension of Nan as being kind of in love with both of these people. But there's a major storyline that is not in the book. There also was something that was really pretty different for me in the book. And it really sort of clarified one of my reactions to the show. So in the novel, Laura Testvalley is really central. She's like almost like the second most important person after Nan. And in it, and she's very well developed. There's lots of stuff about her last name used to be Testvalley. I was like, when they first were talking about Miss Testvalley, I was like, Testvalley? Like, what kind of a name is that? Turns out it is an English version, which that's so weird that they would do that. It's an English version of Testavalle, I guess you would say in Italian, Testavalle, and very much is made, and actually there's quite a bit of poetry in the book, very much is made that she is related to the Rossettis. And in the book, she's really decisive. She's like a very kind of important character in many ways. And she does have that affair with Dick Marable. I'm pretty sure Marable is their last name. Although these last names are tricky for me because it's also Brittlesea, but maybe Brittlesea is like their title or something, and Marable is like their kind of normal last name. But I imagine that you, as a viewer, remember the affair that Dick has with the governess, and much is made of that in the show. It's kind of this like gross thing. And in the book, it's not a great thing, but one very important issue is that she's much younger in the book. Well, she seems much younger. The casting of that woman as Laura Testvalley and making her kind of like threatening and like immoral in the television show was a real departure. So in the book, she's about 27 or 28. I think she's probably 28. And Dick Marable is like 20 or something. So, I mean, still not great. And you could argue that a governess is in like a position of authority and that she is abusing her authority, certainly. But the idea of him as being significantly older and her as being significantly younger in the book is pretty different than the idea that Dick had been abused and that his parents had done nothing about it. So that is not in the book. What we have instead is a much more consensual feeling situation. And Laura Testvalley also, she's really kind of scrappy in many ways, and she's very savvy about kind of not exactly getting what she wants, but she's living a life that is in many ways very satisfactory to her. There's another woman in the book who's very important. Her name is Miss March, and she is this matchmaker. And we have this kind of strain of these young women who are these spinsters who have chosen not to marry or did not get married for whatever reason, but they're very strong and kind of instrumental in terms of plot. And I really liked the idea of Wharton giving us certainly, mostly description of these striving, wealthy people, but we also have really excellent descriptions of people from different social classes. Sadly, another major difference is that there is no affair between Honoria and Mabel. I was very curious and was really hoping that at least there would be some innuendo, and there isn't really. I loved that strain in the actual television show, really wanted to see it in the novel, but no. And of course, there are differences, and differences are important to sort of point out. But I, for the most part, was kind of shook by how faithful the adaptation was. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about what makes this prose incredible. And I realize that we've already talked quite a bit about that, and we've had some pretty good dig ins to a few of these passages. But I just want to read one of the three that I chose to show you the kind of sensuality and the original and really compelling nature of the prose. So on page 34, we have the first time that Miss Testvalley is seeing all of these young American buccaneers. The driver pulled up with a queer guttural cry to his horses. The poodle leapt down and began to dance on its hind legs, and out of the hack poured a spring torrent of muslins, sash ends, and bright cheeks under swaying hat brims. Miss Testvalley found herself in a circle of nymphs. Nymphs, I can't say that word, nymphs. Miss Testvalley found herself in a circle of nymphs shaken by hysterical laughter, and as she stood there, small, brown, interrogative, there swept through her mind a shred of verse which Dante Gabriel used to be fond of reciting. Whence came ye, merry damsels, whence came ye, so many, and such glee? Which is actually a very beautiful little snippet. Whence in that situation, meaning like, where have you come from? But what I loved about this, we have this incredible description that really captures the kind of energy and the kind of impression that would have been made on Miss Testvalley. The part where we have, out of the hack poured a spring torrent of muslins, sash ends, and bright cheeks under swaying hat brims. It's like you have this idea of spring, obviously, and you have the idea of this river, which is such a beautiful kind of metaphor. And then she goes on to describe the fabrics and the sash ends, like you're getting bits and pieces as if we were watching kind of a river of young women. I also like the idea of the swaying hat brims because it sort of carries on swaying. It could be like trees kind of over the river. It carries through this idea of movement. So we have torrent, which is like really a lot of energy. And then we also have the idea of things swaying. It's also very apt that she uses the word spring. Many times, a good writer will use the seasons to describe things. So here, spring, of course, is about growth, and it's about burgeoning things, and it's about fecundity. Not so much fecundity, because that's more like not so much fertility and stuff. I think that comes a little more with the fall and the harvest, maybe summertime. But you have this idea of these young women as being like the spring, in the sense that they are just on the cusp of adulthood and they're about to sort of blossom into themselves. Which I have to say, I really did like the hydrangeas. I thought the hydrangeas were an awesome part of the opening. I liked the like weird vibrant color and the fat like Buccaneers written on top of it. I just didn't like all those like weird flowers kind of appearing. It seemed also just like really out of tone with the rest of the show. But the point that I was making here is that Wharton again and again and again delivers these paragraphs, sentences, chapters of prose that is unique and evocative and just so, so good. So we're not going to look at too much more of that, but there's lots of figurative language. And, we just saw it, the idea of the spring torrent. That's a very good metaphor. But we also have this amazing metaphor. I could pull out hundreds of these, which I'm not going to do. But this one was particularly good. Nan is talking about the Duke, who she's married to at this point. And she says, anger was too large a garment for him. It hung on him in uneasy folds. That is so beautiful. I mean, obviously it is not necessary to throw in this kind of figurative language. She could have just said that, he was uneasy in his anger. Instead, we have this beautiful idea of anger sort of cloaking him, but also him being uneasy. It's so deft and it's so good. We have a lot of symbolism. There's this one amazing part. It just is like, it should be kind of too on the nose, like it should feel kind of overwrought, but it is so excellent, which is when Mrs. St. George and Mrs. Elmsworth are in one of these like English, manor houses, and they're like desperate to be getting their girls married off. And in the manor house, there's a clock that loses 5 minutes every day, which is so excellent. Like, not even, it's not that like time has stopped and they have to have like musical chairs and they've got to suddenly like wrap things up. In fact, they're losing time. It also speaks to the fact of them aging, it speaks to time in general, but also it's another one of these pressures that, there's a narrow window for these young women to get married. And this clock is emphasizing all of the pressure of that. So if this is a section about like how incredible the prose is, one thing I want to touch on here is how incredibly well she does these minor characters. And minor characters, obviously, we are going to form an impression on like what they do and what they say, which many people would tell you is more important if you are a writer. But in many ways, we have a narrator here who's doing a lot of telling, and it's extremely effective. So I already gave you a hint about Miss Testvalley, and I was like, maybe I shouldn't read this whole paragraph because I have already sort of given you my 2 cents about how well she is fleshed out. But this prose is so beautiful that I actually do want to share it with you. And one other thing while I'm reading this to think about is just the way that this broadens the scope of the novel and really adds some heft. So here we have a little backstory on Miss Testvalley. This is early. This is only page 32 of a book that is, I'm checking, 406 pages long. So we have this. Miss Testvalley's grandfather was the illustrious patriot Gennaro Testavaglia. Oh, I spelled it wrong earlier. I said Valle. It is Testa and then Vaglia. Testavaglia of Modena, fomenter of insurrections, hero of the Risorgimento, author of those once famous historical novels, Arnaldo da Brescia and La Donna della Fortezza. I'm reading those in a Spanish accent. I do not speak Italian. But whose fame, this is her father, but whose fame lingered in England chiefly because he was the cousin of the old Gabriele Rossetti, father of the decried and illustrious Dante Gabriel. The Testavaglias, fleeing from the Austrian Inquisition, had come to England at the same time as the Rossettis, and, contracting their impossible name to the scope of English lips, had intermarried with other exiled revolutionaries and anti-papists, producing sons who were artists and agnostics, and daughters who were evangelicals of the strictest pattern and governesses of the highest families. Laura Testvalley had obediently followed the family tradition. So you can see like how much historical depth. I mean, Laura Testvalley, we really actually know a lot about her. And a paragraph like that could feel a little out of step with the rest of the novel. And actually, it kind of does. When we have the naming of these historical figures, you have the idea that the book is really like grounded in history. It's grounded in actual experience, which makes the whole thing feel much more real. And yes, in this case, she does get a little more specific, and you kind of have the sense that she like really wanted to inject these names and these titles into a novel. So it feels like a tiny bit forced, but I really loved it. And the saving grace is there's quite a bit of this kind of depth about minor characters elsewhere. So that is such a feat. I mean, we know a lot about Nan and Conchita right from the beginning. We know a lot about all of the girls. We heard that paragraph about Lizzie Elmsworth. We end up feeling really knowledgeable about the main characters, but also about these minor characters. The last one I want to look at, I think, is so amazing. It's on page 57. This is a description of Conchita's mother. And this is another, I mean, we know very little about her, actually. We know she's Brazilian, that's all, and she has a son and a daughter, and she's married to Colonel Clausen. But get this, like, just like incredible characterization. Okay, here we have on page 57. Mrs. Clausen listened with her dreamy smile. Her attention had none of the painful precision with which Mrs. St. George tried to master the details of social life in the higher spheres, nor of the eager curiosity gleaming under Mrs. Parmore's pale eyelashes. Mrs. Clausen really could not see that there was much difference between one human being and another, except that some had been favored with more leisure than others, and leisure was her idea of heaven. Okay, so good. She also, there's another description of her like lounging around smoking cigars. which are a total phallic symbol. If a woman is smoking cigars at any point, you can read that as her essentially having a stand-in penis. And she does. This is a woman who managed to provide herself a lot of leisure, which apparently is what she wants. So she has a certain amount of power in the book. She's a very minor character, but the way that the narrator just allowed us to get into her mind and to distinguish her from these other mothers, and then to give her that amazing idea that she understands that people are all the same. That is not something that is shared by many characters in the novel, so it really makes her stand out. And it also does the important work of having the reader understand that in the Gilded Age here, there were people who understood just the folly and understood the basic premise that people are the same. Okay, to conclude, I'm going to read you. I'm going to read you out. I'm going to finish with some of Edith Wharton's beautiful prose. But before I do that, I just want to mention maybe the most important thing, which is I found like the spirit of the TV adaptation and the novel were really very similar. There were obviously many changes that actually made it more dynamic and interesting for television, this kind of episodic 2-season thing that we got, but also for audiences in 2025. But in both, you had this really important look at the way that societal expectations for women can be really suffocating and really awful. They also both do this thing, which most of these period pieces do. They really do make me appreciate the fact that I was not living then. Most of this, I was like on my couch in my PJs or my sweats, convalescing. And I was really psyched that I could just be wearing like a t-shirt and I like could go get a coffee in my slippers. But I have to say, when I read the novel, which was just a delight, I was really struck by, first of all, how modern Edith Wharton's messages were, but also by the optimism and the strength and the really incisive look at women that we get both in Wharton and in the television show. So the way that we're going to close, I think, is actually pretty spectacular. Not because of my effort, but simply because of how fate works here in the publication of this novel. So what I want to read to you at the end of this discussion is the end of the manuscript that Edith Wharton wrote. This is so eerie and so beautiful that I just was kind of shocked when I read it. So what I'm about to read to you is the end of chapter 29. So after this point, we have Marion taking over, but this beautiful, beautiful paragraph was the last part of the sections of the novel, the 3/4 of the novel that Wharton wrote herself. It's so moving. Okay, here we have this on 291. The drive back to Champions passed like a dream. To secure herself against disturbance, Nan had slipped her hand into Miss Testvalley's and let her head droop on the governess's shoulder. She heard one of the Glenlow girls whisper, "The Duchess is asleep," and a conniving silence seemed to enfold her. But she hadn't a wish to sleep. Her wide-eyed eyes looked out into the falling night, caught the glint of lights flashing past in the high street, lost themselves in the long intervals of dusk between the villages, and plunged into deepening night as the low glimmer of the west went out. In her heart was a deep, delicious peace, such as she had never known before. In this great, lonely desert of life stretching out before her, she had a friend who understood not only all she said, but everything she could not say. At the end of the long road on which the regular rap of the horses' feet was beating out the hours, she saw him standing, waiting for her, watching for her through the night. Unbelievable, so gorgeous, and so eerie. I mean, this is a woman, actually don't know how she died. I'm assuming that she was ill. If she died suddenly, this is not quite as impressive, although maybe still impressive. What she has written here is this beautiful sense of things waning and things ending and lights going out and evening falling in a way that is so evocative of death. But what's beautiful is it's also this incredibly like warm and comforting passage. Nan is very close with Miss Testvalley, and we have them physically bonded together. We have her comfortable enough to sleep, but she's also thinking of Guy and the fact that she has someone in her life who knows her so, so well. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there with that incredible paragraph. And I'm going to hope that this talk today was a fun kind of addition to the television show, but also that it helped you appreciate how unbelievably great Edith Wharton is. I will stand by my recommendation that I made at the very beginning, which is, I mean, if you're a total Edith Wharton fan and you've read all the rest of it, then absolutely read The Buccaneers. But if you're someone who doesn't plan on reading the entire oeuvre, which honestly you couldn't, I mean, you could, but she was very prolific. But my recommendation stands, which is, maybe go pick one, either The Age of Innocence or The House of Mirth, which are absolute masterpieces. The Age of Innocence, actually, it was published in 1920, and she won the Pulitzer Prize for it in 1921. So maybe you start with that one. But I really hope that whether or not you go on to read any more Edith Wharton, you had a little sense of the absolute genius of this woman. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.